Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that looks a lot like our own, but colder, hungrier, and far more afraid. Most people today have heard of the Salem Witch Trials. Maybe you remember a few names, a few dates, or just the word witch. But beneath the legend and history of legal disputes with neighbors, she had been accused of witchcraft once before, decades earlier, but had been acquitted. Now, her past was used against her, repackaged and magnified. The afflicted girls claimed they saw her spirit tormenting them. She was accused of keeping poppets, dolls used in sympathetic magic, and of bewitching a neighbor's pig. Bishop denied it all. She declared her innocence with clarity and frustration. She claimed she feared God, that she had never dealt in dark arts, that she was a good Christian woman. But her tone, forceful, indignant, unapologetic, was not what the court wanted to hear. Her refusal to submit was interpreted not as confidence, but arrogance. The girls screamed when she entered the room. They fainted when she looked at them. They convulsed when she tried to speak. And the judges listened to them, not her. She was found guilty. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill. There was no prayer, no blessing. Her grave was unmarked. Her name, written in ink on the court scrolls, became a milestone, not the beginning of caution, but the green light for a campaign of destruction that was only just beginning. From that point forward, the court accelerated its process. More than 60 people stood accused by early July. The afflicted girls testified in trial after trial, often giving near identical accounts of pain, suffocation, burning, and spectral visitation. The judges asked no follow-up questions. They rarely pressed for consistency. They allowed hearsay, dreams, and visions to take the place of fact. One particularly disturbing form of evidence was the touch test. If an afflicted person was in a fit, and the accused laid hands on them, and the fit ceased, this was taken as proof that the accused had been controlling the fit with their magic. The logic was reversed. The accused were assumed guilty, and any physical coincidence became validation of that guilt. A few voices in the colony dared to question this madness. Reverend Increase Mather, one of New England's most respected ministers, warned that it was better that 10 witches escape than one innocent person be condemned. But by the time he spoke, the hangings had already begun. Nathaniel Saltonstall, one of the appointed judges, resigned in protest after Bridget Bishop's execution, but his seat was quickly filled. His absence was not a turning point. It was a footnote. And so, the court continued. The judges believed they were doing holy work, that they were rescuing souls, that the cost of a few earthly lives was a price worth paying to protect eternity. They were wrong. But they would not realize it, not yet. In their chambers, they sharpened the quills. On the scaffold, they tightened the ropes, and on the gallows, the bodies began to swing. By the summer of 1692, it had become clear to the accused that innocence was not a shield, it was a sentence. Those who stood firm and declared, with unshakable faith, that they had never signed the devil's book or consorted with demons were led to the gallows. But those who whispered yes, those who murmured what the court wanted to hear, were allowed to live, at least for a while. Confession became a weapon, not of guilt, but of survival. The first few confessions had shocked the town. Tituba's vivid stories of dark meetings in the woods and flying spirits were seen as remarkable at the time, even scandalous. But as more people saw what that confession had bought her, time, attention, even sympathy, they began to consider it not as betrayal, but as strategy. If one could lie convincingly, and name others along the way, the court would often grant mercy. And so, one by one, the confessions began to roll in. Deliverance Hobbs admitted to witchcraft and said she had flown through the air at the devil's command. Mary Warren, who had once been among the afflicted, reversed course and claimed that she herself had become a witch, under pressure. Abigail Hobbs, only 14 years old, confessed as well, describing Satan as a black dog with yellow eyes who promised her a better life. Some spoke of red marks and spectral birds, others of dark books and invisible Sabbaths. The more fantastical the tale, the more seriously it was taken, and when asked who else had joined them, they gave names. Sometimes, they accused their enemies. Sometimes, they accused strangers. Sometimes, they accused their own family. One woman named her mother. A boy named his brother. Entire households became splintered under the weight of forced survival. And each new name gave the court new purpose. The more people were accused, the more it validated the crisis. The more it justified the court's existence. There was no incentive to hold the line. The system punished dignity and rewarded betrayal. So, people chose betrayal. But that didn't mean it was easy. Confession did not erase the pain. It didn't clear one's name. It didn't even ensure safety. Those who confessed were still jailed, sometimes for months, still shackled, still forced to watch others hang. They were still hungry, still cold, still uncertain of whether the court might change its mind. But at least they were alive. And in a world where the sound of the gallows creaking had become familiar, staying alive, at any cost, felt like the only rational goal. Yet not everyone followed that path. Some refused, even knowing what it meant. Rebecca Nurse, old, pious, beloved by her church, never confessed. Not when the court demanded it, not when her neighbors begged her to, not even when she stood beneath the hanging tree. Her silence was not confusion. It was defiance. She had been declared not guilty at first, a rare breath of reason in a room thick with madness. But it didn't last. As the verdict echoed through the court, the afflicted girls collapsed again into shrieks and spasms. Their theatrics worked. The judges recalled the jury. The decision was reversed. Mercy was revoked. And Rebecca, who had touched the edge of freedom, was sentenced to hang. John Proctor, a man of pride and temper, also refused. He saw the court for what it was, a circus of panic masked in robes, and declared it so. He told them that the girls were liars, that the judges were being manipulated, that the entire town had gone mad. He begged for justice, for reason, for decency, and for that, he was sentenced to die. Before that, he wrote letters, urgent, furious, desperate, pleading with the ministers of Boston to intervene, to stop the slaughter, to listen. But no one came. His words vanished like steam against the iron wall of silence. In the end, they took his name, but not his soul. He would rather die than damn himself with a lie. His wife, Elizabeth Proctor, also accused, was spared only because she was pregnant. Her execution was delayed until she gave birth, a delay that would later become a reprieve when the court began to unravel. But she, too, refused to lie. Even with a child growing inside her, even with death imminent, she would not damn her soul to save her body. Others, like Giles Corey, took their resistance further. When charged, he refused to enter a plea. He knew that if he pleaded, he would be tried, found guilty, and executed, and his property would be forfeited to the state. But by staying silent, he denied the court jurisdiction. To punish him, they used pressing, a medieval form of torture in which heavy stones were placed upon the chest until the body could take no more. He endured it for days. When asked to plead, he reportedly said only, "More weight." He died without confessing. His land passed to his sons. His silence became a kind of legend, but he died in agony. The courts, of course, saw no heroism in these denials. They saw obstinacy, rebellion, proof of guilt. But to the few who watched with eyes not yet clouded by fear, these acts of resistance revealed a truth the court refused to face. The only people confessing were those who feared death more than dishonor. The court did not deal in forgiveness. It dealt in self-preservation. And every false confession it accepted only deepened the injustice, because with each name uttered, more lives were ruined, more nooses prepared, more graves dug. The witches, it seemed, multiplied. But they weren't multiplying because the devil was expanding his reach. They were multiplying because the court was demanding it. It was a harvest fed by lies. The truth, as it turns out, had no place in Salem. Not in its jails, not in its courtrooms, and certainly not on its scaffold. By midsummer, the rhythm of Salem had changed. The Sabbath bells still rang, sermons were still preached, and the marketplace still bustled with the exchange of fish, grain, and gossip. But something darker had settled into the town's bones. What had begun as a spiritual crisis had become a routine of death. Trials no longer felt like moments of decision. They felt like formalities, the necessary prelude to a sentence already written. After Bridget Bishop, the executions became more frequent. On July 19th, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca's death struck many as unbearable. She was 71 years old, a beloved matron of the church, known for her piety, her calmness, her care for the sick. Even the jury had initially found her not guilty, until pressured by the judges to reconsider. In the end, a moment of hesitation in her testimony, one misunderstood phrase, was enough to seal her fate. She went to the gallows in silence. When asked for a final confession, she said only, "I am innocent. I have no one to accuse." She died with dignity, but dignity did not save her. In August, the tempo increased again. 5 more executions, this time including Martha Carrier, whom Cotton Mather had called the Queen of Hell. Her children had been tortured into confessing that she had bewitched them. Her neighbors had testified that her presence brought misfortune. She maintained her innocence until the end. They hanged her anyway. Each hanging followed the same pattern. The accused were taken in an open cart through the center of town. The people gathered. Some came out of curiosity. Others brought their children. It was treated like a necessary evil, a ritual of cleansing. The condemned were offered one last chance to confess. Some did. Most didn't. The noose was placed. The cart was kicked away. The bodies swung. There was no burial. The corpses were cut down and dumped into shallow, unmarked pits. Families were forbidden from retrieving them. The bodies of the accused, even in death, were denied dignity. They became warnings, symbols, proof that the courts were doing their work. By September, the fear reached its peak. 8 people were hanged in a single day. One of them was John Proctor, a man of considerable land and status. His pleas to the court, his reasoned letters, his arguments against the use of spectral evidence had gone unheard. His wife, Elizabeth, remained in jail. Her execution postponed only because she was pregnant. John died with no confession. He had been vocal to the end, accusing the court itself of witchcraft, of bewitching the people into believing in lies. Another was Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse. She had been released, then rearrested after new accusations. She wrote a letter to the court before her execution, begging them not to accept further spectral evidence. It was polite, sorrowful, and heartfelt. It was ignored. And then there was Giles Corey. He was never hanged. He refused to stand trial. To plead either guilty or not guilty would have given the court power over him. So he said nothing. As punishment, he was pressed to death. He died without a plea, and because of that, his land remained in his family's name. His silence, like Proctor's words, became legend. By autumn, the executions were no longer shocking. They were expected. The gallows became a fixture. The people adjusted to the sound of verdicts and the sight of wagons carrying the condemned uphill. And those who watched, who once cried, or prayed, or trembled, began to do so less. There was a numbness now. A detachment. Salem was no longer a village hunting witches. It had become a village watching itself bleed. By the time the leaves began to fall in 1692, Salem's court was no longer a tribunal in search of justice. It had become a machine for controlled destruction, one that could not be stopped without risking the collapse of the very authority that had built it. The magistrates, once seen as wise guardians of law, had transformed into figures of dread. Their black robes no longer represented impartiality, but a kind of sacerdotal power, unquestioned, unsympathetic, and increasingly self-serving. And at the center of it all stood Chief Magistrate William Stoughton. Stoughton was not a man easily swayed, educated, rigid, deeply devout. He had made up his mind early on that Satan was real, that witches were his agents, and that New England was under siege. In his worldview, doubt was not caution, it was cowardice. He believed that it was better to err on the side of punishment than to risk letting a guilty soul escape divine retribution. And so, with grim certainty, he presided over trial after trial, welcoming confession, encouraging accusation, and defending the use of spectral evidence with unshakable resolve. To Stoughton and others like him, justice was no longer about fairness. It was about control, and when control is threatened, truth becomes optional. Behind the scenes, that control was unraveling. Whispers began to circulate that the court was being manipulated, not by Satan, but by men with agendas. One of the most infamous was Thomas Putnam, father of afflicted girl Anne Putnam Jr., and a man with long-standing grievances and ambitions. His daughter's accusations seemed to fall with eerie precision upon those who owned land adjacent to his, those with whom he had legal quarrels, or those whose removal would somehow strengthen his position in the village. It was never proven, but it didn't need to be. The timing spoke volumes. The patterns were undeniable. And still, the court accepted every word. Because to question the motives behind an accusation was to question the accuser's divine sensitivity, and to question that was to flirt with heresy. The system fed on this silence. It relied on it. Every player, judge, juror, accuser, and neighbor understood that the rules had changed, and anyone who challenged them did so at their own peril. Some tried. Reverend John Hale, one of the early supporters of the trials, began to hesitate when his own wife was accused. Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, as mentioned earlier, had resigned in protest after the execution of Bridget Bishop. His absence should have sparked introspection, but instead, it was filled by another who followed the script more obediently. Even Governor Phipps, who had established the court himself, began to sense that things had spiraled beyond control, particularly when accusations reached his own circle. But the system resisted every attempt at restraint. Stoughton, in particular, pushed forward with a kind of righteous fervor. He ignored petitions. He overruled appeals. He upheld verdicts even when new evidence emerged. In one case, a man was convicted solely on the basis of spectral evidence and hanged, despite protests from other ministers. Stoughton later claimed that God would sort out the innocent from the guilty in the afterlife. For now, the court's duty was to act, and act swiftly. In the background, families wept, children were orphaned, property was seized, and a new kind of fear took root. Not fear of witches, but fear of the court itself. Ordinary citizens began to wonder if the trials would ever end, or if, like a fire that had consumed the forest, it would eventually turn on the village itself. The afflicted girls, emboldened by their power, began naming more and more people. The scope widened: ministers, magistrates, even Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife. And with that, the illusion cracked. Because while it had been easy to believe in witches when they were poor, isolated, or strange, it became harder to believe when the net caught the powerful. If even the governor's wife could be accused, then who was safe? If every denial was proof of guilt, then how could anyone survive? The same people who once whispered approval of the trials now whispered something else. Had they gone too far? And what would happen when Salem had no one left to hang but its own judges? But justice, when twisted, does not apologize. It doubles down. And in those final weeks of the trials, that's exactly what the court did. The executions continued. The jails remained full. The petitions for clemency were rejected, and the girls were still believed. Until, finally, the machine overreached. When the accusations threatened to engulf the entire colony's leadership, when wives of governors and ministers were being named, when even Stoughton's allies began to question the court's direction, Governor Phipps stepped in. And Stoughton? He was furious. He protested the governor's decision to halt executions. He insisted that those already sentenced should hang, regardless of political consequence. He even sought to continue the trials under new pretexts. But the tide had turned. And, though justice in Salem had long since been lost, something else now rose in its place: self-preservation among the powerful. The very people who had allowed the court to flourish were now the ones dismantling it, not out of remorse, but out of fear that they would be next. And so, slowly, reluctantly, the wheels began to slow. But the damage had already been done. What had once been a courtroom was now a graveyard. What had once been a village had become a warning, and those who had played the game, whether for belief, ambition, or survival, would carry its weight for the rest of their lives. Every fire eventually runs out of fuel. In the early months of the Salem witch panic, that fuel had been easy to find. Poor women, outcasts, the sick, the outspoken, the odd, the town fed on them, one by one. But when so many of the obvious suspects were gone, and the court still needed bodies, the accusations began to crawl inward, into the center of the village's life. The witch hunt no longer stalked the edges. It began to chew through its own heart. And Salem, finally, began to feel it. By September 1692, accusations were no longer aimed just at widows, beggars, or those already mistrusted. Instead, they reached into the homes of ministers, merchants, respected church members, even the relatives of the judges themselves. Wives of magistrates were named. So were cousins of clergymen. Longtime allies of the court found their doors knocked on. Friends who had whispered their support for the trials suddenly found their own names whispered back. It became a mirror Salem could no longer bear to look into. Mary Easty, sister of the hanged Rebecca Nurse, had been released from prison after a long interrogation. Her family rejoiced, briefly, but within days. The afflicted girls claimed her specter had returned. New fits, new screams. The court reversed its decision. She was arrested again. She wrote a letter to the judges, not begging for her own life, but for the end of all executions. Her words were calm, haunting, soaked in dignity and sorrow. I petition your honors not for my own life, but for the lives of others, that no more innocent blood be shed. They hanged her anyway. Then came Anne Foster, an elderly woman in Andover, frail and near death. After days of isolation, interrogation, and seeing her daughter and granddaughter both accused, she confessed. Not because she believed it, not because it was true, but because the weight of survival fell heavier than the truth. She died in prison. The court had crossed into new territory. It was no longer simply condemning the powerless. It was turning on the very people who had enabled it. Even Ann Putnam Jr., one of the original afflicted girls, began accusing people closer to home. She said her former caretaker had bewitched her. She accused a minister's wife. She turned on old friends. And her father, Thomas Putnam, once thought to be orchestrating much of the chaos, began to lose control of it. No one could direct the storm anymore. The hysteria that had once been aimed with precision now moved like smoke, drifting, unpredictable, deadly. A neighbor's silence was suspect. A widow's grief was suspicious. A minister's frown at the wrong moment could become an omen. The entire village became a theater of self-surveillance. Those who had been quick to accuse now grew quiet. Those who had urged caution now dared to speak louder. And those who had said nothing at all began to ask, what if it's me next? The courts, sensing the tremors, pushed harder. More arrests, more confessions, more gallows. But for the first time, cracks began to show. People who once believed the afflicted girls without hesitation now raised eyebrows. The girls' fits had become more elaborate, their stories more bizarre, their circle of accused wider than ever before. Some villagers began to mutter that the devil might not be in the accused, but in the accusers. Then came the final straw. When the afflicted girls named Lady Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, the very man who had established the court of Oyez and Terminer, the absurdity could no longer be ignored. The court had begun to devour its creators. And with that, the house of cards began to collapse. The governor moved swiftly. He dissolved the special court, replacing it with a new judicial body, one that would no longer accept spectral evidence, one that would actually require something resembling proof. Trials were suspended. Some prisoners were released. Confessions were re-evaluated. Those who had not yet been executed were suddenly, awkwardly spared. But there were no public apologies. No ceremonies to honor the dead, no reparations, no proclamations of error. Instead, Salem entered a kind of stunned silence. The gallows stood empty, its ropes still swaying in memory. The jails no longer echoed with screams, but remained crowded with the forgotten. The families of the dead returned to homes that now felt like tombs. The afflicted girls stopped having fits, just like that, as if nothing had happened. But something had. And everyone knew it. The town that once burned with righteous certainty now sat in a fog of shame. The church that had claimed to root out evil now struggled to explain its own complicity. The judges who had sentenced neighbors to die now walked through town with their heads low, pretending the dust on their hands was no different from anyone else's. And the people? They whispered, they wondered, and many, perhaps for the first time, began to regret. Not loudly, not together, but late at night, in corners, in prayer, in guilt. Because the fire was out. But the ashes were still warm. When Governor William Phips returned to Massachusetts from a military campaign in the North, he found a colony unrecognizable. Salem, once a rigidly devout but orderly town, had transformed into a place of whispers and gallows, of crying children and unmarked graves. What had begun as a flicker of spiritual concern had become a judicial inferno, fueled by fear, then pride, then momentum. He had left behind a church grumbling about deviance. He returned to find a legal system hanging its own people on the strength of invisible evidence. But what made the change real, what pulled him out of the fog of political hesitation, was not the bodies already buried. It was the moment the accusations came for his own wife. The afflicted girls, once believed to be mere vessels of divine sensitivity, had named Lady Mary Phips. Whether they meant to, whether they were manipulated, or whether it was the natural progression of a panic that could no longer distinguish between guilt and proximity. The message landed with brutal clarity. No one was safe anymore, not even the governor's family. Phips did not hesitate. In late October 1692, he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the same tribunal he had commissioned just months earlier. He ordered that no more arrests were to be made for witchcraft, and declared that spectral evidence would no longer be admissible in court. Without it, the cases collapsed almost immediately. Testimonies that once had girls writhing on the courtroom floor now fell flat. Accusers were met with silence. Judges sat still. The wind had changed, and the fire, finally, began to die. A new court was established, the Superior Court of Judicature, with different rules, different standards, and, perhaps most importantly, a different sense of caution. The frenzy had peaked, and now, slowly, the structure built on its hysteria began to fall in on itself. But there was no celebration. There was no public reckoning, no ringing of bells, no town-wide fast of repentance. There was only quiet, an exhausted, heavy kind of quiet. The gallows stood untouched, its frame grayed by weather and memory. The jails remained full, though no new names were added to the rolls. The court's scribes, once so busy cataloging charges and deaths, now returned to documenting releases, petitions, and the dull paperwork of reversal. Phips never admitted fault. He blamed the chaos on the judges and the afflicted girls. He suggested that the court had moved too quickly, that perhaps too much trust had been placed in popular fury. He pardoned those still imprisoned. Many were released, but not all at once. Some lingered in jail, not because they were still suspected of witchcraft, but because they could not pay their jail fees, the cruel toll exacted for food, shackles, and straw bedding. Even Tituba, whose confession had started the fire, remained behind bars for months. No one paid to retrieve her. Reverend Paris, her master, refused. She was eventually sold to another family, and after that, she vanished from the record. No death certificate, no gravestone, just silence. Many others who survived emerged to find their lives in ruin. John Proctor's widow, Elizabeth, gave birth in jail. Though spared from execution, she returned to a home without a husband, a reputation stained by accusation, and a child born into a name the town no longer spoke with respect. Rebecca Nurse's family, devastated by her execution, secretly dug up her body from the site near Gallows Hill and reburied her on their farm under the cover of darkness. The state had refused to return the body. So, her children, with quiet rage, took her back. Others who had confessed to save themselves now bore the weight of those confessions. They had named friends, neighbors, family. They had lied in desperation, and though it had bought their lives, it had also left them branded. The court may have closed, but the shame didn't. In sermons, ministers attempted to shift the narrative. Some called the trials a test from God. Others suggested that the devil had tricked the court itself, that even righteous men could be used for dark purposes. But in private, the conversations were harder. In parlors, in taverns, in pews, people remembered who had accused, who had testified, who had cheered when the cart rolled toward Gallows Hill. They also remembered who had died. And no amount of theological spinning could change that. As for William Stoughton, the chief judge who had presided over most of the executions, he never apologized. He would go on to serve again as acting governor. He never questioned the court's actions, never expressed regret. In his eyes, the trials had been a necessary purge, a sacrifice for spiritual clarity. And that is perhaps the final tragedy. Because justice in Salem wasn't undone by remorse, it was undone by convenience. The trials didn't stop because the town rediscovered its conscience. They stopped because the court had turned on its own creators, and those in power saw that continuing the executions might cost them more than it gained. In the end, what halted the madness wasn't virtue. It was self-preservation. And the people of Salem were left to sort through the wreckage alone, with their dead buried in secret, their names blackened, and their faith bruised in ways no church could mend. The executions ended, the court dissolved, the noose hung unused, and Gallows Hill fell silent. But for those who survived the witch trials, life did not simply resume. There were no welcome home banners, no public absolution, no sense that the nightmare had passed and the world had reset. What came after was not recovery. It was something colder, a long, uneasy silence where healing should have been. Those who had confessed and lived were not celebrated. They returned to homes stripped bare, to communities that regarded them with suspicion. Neighbors stared without speaking. Church pews seemed smaller, colder. A man who once confessed under pressure now found his business avoided. A woman who had saved herself by naming others walked through the market like a ghost, knowing that behind every glance might be the face of someone whose mother had hanged. Confession, once a ticket to life, had become a lifelong curse. Even those who had never confessed, who had stood firm and survived, were not greeted as heroes. Some had escaped execution only because the court had closed in time. Others had been released after months in jail, emaciated, scarred by cold and hunger. They stepped out of the prison gates not into celebration, but into uncertainty. Elizabeth Proctor, widow of John Proctor, had given birth in her cell. Her execution had been delayed for that reason alone. When she was released, her husband was gone, her home was depleted, and her name, once respected, was whispered with pity or resentment. Though later her conviction would be formally reversed, the town offered no restitution, no rebuilding of what had been lost. Tituba, whose confession had ignited the court's fury, remained behind bars long after others were freed, not because she was feared, but because no one wanted to pay the cost of her release. In the end, she was sold to an unknown new master, and with that transaction, her story vanished. She disappears from the record, not hanged, not pardoned, simply erased. Then there were those who had endured prison for months without conviction. Families went bankrupt, paying jail fees. Some prisoners were released only when friends or distant relatives managed to scrape together enough to satisfy the court's financial demands. If no one came for you, you stayed. Innocence meant nothing. Debts meant everything. Anne Foster, aged and frail, had confessed only after being isolated, threatened, and told that her daughter and granddaughter would hang if she didn't. She died in prison before the court changed its mind. Her body was never recovered. Her family buried the memory in silence. Some survivors tried to rebuild. They went back to their homes, if they still had them. They tried to return to their churches, if they were still welcomed. Some remarried, some moved away, others never left, but never truly came back either. They existed in a kind of social limbo, not criminal, but not clean, not cursed, but not forgiven. The town itself didn't speak of it. Not publicly. There were no monuments erected, no official days of mourning. Gallows Hill was left unmarked. The graves of the executed were not honored. Their bodies, dumped into crevices and ravines, were denied even the dignity of a headstone. Many families, quietly, secretly, retrieved their loved ones' remains in the dead of night and buried them in family plots without ceremony. And yet, the names lingered. The silence around them was heavy. Every church service, every wedding, every funeral after 1693 carried the weight of those who weren't there, people once trusted, now gone, left behind by a town that had traded justice for panic. And still, there were the children. They were supposed to be innocent. In the theology of the Puritans, children were often viewed as vessels of sin, waiting to be shaped by faith and discipline. But they were still, by nature, impressionable and dependent, rarely granted full agency. And yet, in Salem during the trials, children were not only given voices, they were given power. Not the symbolic power of moral instruction or religious example, but literal, legal power, the kind that sent people to their deaths. It began with a handful of girls: Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, and several others, ranging in age from 9 to 16, first exhibited symptoms of what the court would later call affliction. They screamed, they convulsed, they pointed into empty space and claimed invisible torments. At first, they were pitied, then believed, then venerated. Their suffering was interpreted not as theater, nor misbehavior, but as evidence of divine trial. They were seen as victims of the devil's intrusion into the physical world, chosen to expose evil. But something subtle and terrible happened over the weeks that followed. Their suffering became performance, and their performance was given the force of law. The afflicted girls began to appear in courtrooms regularly, not as defendants or observers, but as star witnesses. They would fall into spasms the moment an accused witch was brought into the room. They claimed they were being scratched, bitten, burned, or choked, though their bodies bore no marks. They shrieked, collapsed, and called out names, sometimes clearly, sometimes as riddles that the judges seemed all too willing to solve on their behalf. And the court believed them, unquestioningly. To the magistrates, these girls were not simply sick. They were spiritually sensitive, like human barometers for satanic activity. If they screamed, someone must be hurting them. If they pointed, someone must be guilty. And when their accusations turned to people of higher social standing, landowners, ministers' wives, community leaders, their credibility was not diminished. It was elevated. It meant the devil was cunning, hiding himself among the righteous. No one questioned why the girls' visions conveniently aligned with village gossip, personal disputes, or long-held grudges. No one dared suggest that the children were lying, or confused, or swept up in a shared delusion. To doubt the afflicted was to doubt the existence of evil, and in Salem, such doubt was dangerous. Worse still, children who were not afflicted, but merely present, became tools of the court in even more tragic ways. Children like Dorothy Good, who was only 4 when she was imprisoned. She had confessed, if her incoherent, frightened mumblings could be called that. She had spoken of a snake, of a strange friend her mother talked to, and that was enough. She was kept in chains. By the time she was released, she could barely speak. According to later reports, her mind, perhaps, had not recovered. Others, like Ann Putnam Jr., carried different scars. She had been one of the first accusers, 12 years old, sharp, devout, and eager to please. Over the course of the trials, she had named more than 60 people, ministers, neighbors, friends. 14 years later, in 1706, she stood before the congregation of Salem Village Church and delivered a written confession. I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence, that I was the instrument of accusing several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken from them, whom I now have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent. The congregation forgave her. The dead, of course, could not. Even in confession, Anne claimed she had been deceived by Satan. She did not claim to have lied, and in doing so, she echoed the same theology that had made the trials possible in the first place, that evil moves silently, that it takes many forms, that even the innocent can be its pawns. There were no trials for the judges, no punishments for the accusers, no official apology from the church, not yet. The survivors lived in the ruins, not of a war, not of a fire, but of trust. The fabric of Salem's society, its belief in community, in justice, in godliness, had been burned through. Those who survived did not walk away with peace. They carried instead a new fear, quieter, colder, and perhaps more dangerous than the one that started it all. The fear that truth can be erased, that conscience can be silenced, and that when power decides someone is guilty, survival may depend not on innocence, but on silence, or complicity. And in that silence, the town waited. Not for justice, but for time to do what no court had done. Forget. By the end of 1693, the great engine of the Salem Witch Trials, built on fear, powered by confession, and steered by ambition, had finally run out of names, out of breath, and out of permission. But it did not die in a dramatic collapse. There was no singular moment when the colony rose up and denounced its own courts. There were no shattered gavels, no mobs demanding reparations. Instead, the death of justice came quietly, like the last echo of a hymn no longer sung. The Superior Court of Judicature, created to replace the Court of Oyer and Terminer, heard the remaining witchcraft cases with a new standard, no spectral evidence. Without it, the entire structure of accusation, so reliant on dreams and visions, fell apart almost immediately. Cases that would have once drawn gasps now drew silence. Witnesses stumbled, testimony lost its shape, and one by one, defendants who might have died weeks earlier were acquitted, or quietly dismissed. But the court didn't declare its prior rulings void. There was no retroactive correction for those already buried on Gallows Hill. No one stood to say, "We were wrong." The very judges who had sent 20 people to their deaths now returned to their homes, resumed their duties, and went on with their lives. William Stoughton, who had presided over nearly every execution, remained unrepentant. He never apologized. He believed the court had done what was necessary. When he later became acting governor, he offered no words of regret. In his mind, the dead had not been victims. They had been risks. Better to eliminate too many than allow evil to go unpunished. It would take years for even a fraction of acknowledgement to arrive. In 1697, 5 years after the executions, the General Court of Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and soul-searching, calling it a day of humiliation. It was not an apology. It was not addressed to the families. It was more like an awkward clearing of the throat, an official suggestion that perhaps something had gone wrong, though no one would say exactly what. That same year, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, did what no one else in authority had yet dared. He stood during a church service, bowed his head, and publicly repented. He admitted that the court had erred, that he had erred, that he bore guilt for innocent blood. His confession was not flamboyant. He did not weep, but he stood long enough for everyone to see him, and his prayer was later published. It became the first true gesture of repentance, and the only one for quite some time. Most of the others stayed silent. The afflicted girls never stood trial for their testimony. The ministers who endorsed the court were not removed from their pulpits. The sheriff who signed the death warrants lived out his days undisturbed. There were no formal charges against the accusers, and no inquiry into the incentives behind their claims. The town, perhaps desperate to move forward, allowed a strange agreement to take hold. We will not speak of it, and in return, we will not ask who benefited most. But silence does not bury the truth. In the years that followed, the pain endured, quietly, persistently. Families of the executed struggled to reclaim land, reputations, and basic dignity. Children grew up with names soiled by history. The grandchildren of the dead listened to sermons delivered by men who had stood at the edge of the gallows and said nothing. And those who had lived through it learned to live around it. They avoided certain topics. They stepped wide around certain graves. They rebuilt their fences without asking how they had come to fall. The shadow lingered. It wasn't until 1711, nearly 2 decades after the executions, that the Massachusetts government passed a bill formally reversing the convictions of some, not all, of those who had been tried and executed. Small financial compensation was offered to a few families. The word innocent was used, but sparingly. Even in legal documents, the state seemed to flinch. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and others were finally cleared, but names like Bridget Bishop, Giles Corey, and Sarah Good were left untouched. Their descendants would spend decades petitioning for recognition. For some, that recognition wouldn't come until the 20th century. Yes, you read that correctly. It wasn't until 1957, 265 years after the hangings, that the last of the remaining innocent were formally exonerated by the state of Massachusetts. 265 years. And even then, the official language was subdued, almost reluctant. Because the truth was too sharp, too shameful, too heavy. How do you explain that a court once believed a child's nightmare more than a woman's prayer, that dreams were accepted as testimony, but pleas for mercy were dismissed as cunning? How do you account for a justice system that hanged people for crimes that could not be proven, seen, or explained? You don't. You repent in quiet corners. You let weeds grow over the gallows. And in time, people forget. Or try to. But Salem never really forgot. Not entirely. Because Gallows Hill, though unmarked for centuries, never stopped whispering. The names may have faded from ledgers, but they remained in the soil, in the church pews, in the bones of the town itself. And justice? Real justice, the kind that listens, the kind that waits, the kind that forgives, never walked in those courtrooms. Not once. It's easy to look back and shake our heads. To call the Salem Witch Trials a tragedy, a mistake, a cautionary tale, but doing so requires a kind of distance, one that feels safe, one that makes it seem as though the people of 1692 were somehow not like us, as though we have evolved past hysteria, past fear, past the need to turn on each other when the world stops making sense. But that comfort is an illusion. To truly understand Salem, you have to stand inside the storm. You have to feel what it meant to live in a place where death came not with plague or blade, but with accusation, where the air itself seemed to carry whispers, where every wrong look, every misstep, every night you couldn't sleep might be seen as a sign. So, why did it happen? Why did a town filled with churchgoers, parents, farmers, and judges unravel into chaos? The answers, like the trials themselves, are complex, but we can trace some threads. The Puritans of Massachusetts were not a relaxed people. Their theology was strict, binary, and deeply anxious. They believed the world was a battleground between God and Satan, and that human beings at all times were in danger of falling into darkness. Every crop failure, every stillborn child, every mysterious illness was not just misfortune. It was a message, a test, a punishment. They feared the wilderness that surrounded them. The forest was not just home to wild animals, but to unseen devils. They feared the native tribes they had pushed back violently. They feared the encroaching French Catholics to the north. They feared poverty, famine, war, and most of all, they feared disorder. And in the winter of 1692, that fear cracked open. That winter had been one of the coldest in memory. Food was scarce, disease was spreading. Tensions between neighbors had been rising for years, fueled by land disputes, inheritance battles, and church schisms. The town was already divided, already suspicious, already on edge. And then the girls started screaming. No one knew what to make of it. A doctor had examined them and found no natural cause, concluding they were under an evil hand. The theology rushed in to explain what medicine could not. The devil was at work, and if the devil was near, someone had let him in. The question wasn't whether witches existed. That had been settled. The question was, who? That's where things spiraled. Once accusations began, there was no way to stop them. Denial only proved guilt. Silence was seen as cunning, and confession, that was twisted into salvation, but only if you named others. It became a game where everyone lost, a machine that fed on fear and grew more powerful with every innocent person it destroyed. But Salem was also a place where grievances festered. Old resentments, property disputes, generational rivalries. Once the accusations began, people used them, some consciously, some subconsciously. But the result was the same. Witchcraft became a language of vengeance. If you wanted to destroy a neighbor, all you had to do was suggest a shadow behind their smile. And if the girls screamed when they walked into the room, well, that was enough. And then there was belief. Genuine, trembling belief. Not everyone in Salem was lying. Many truly thought they were doing God's work. The afflicted girls may have believed they were tormented. The judges may have believed they were protecting the colony. Even the confessors may have believed that their sins had opened them to Satan's influence. Fear, when weaponized by religion and given a legal system to anchor itself in, becomes faith twisted against itself. And we must not forget the machinery that made it possible. The courts, the laws, the jails, the gallows. This was not a mob with pitchforks. This was government-sanctioned destruction. The accused were examined by magistrates. Their confessions were recorded, their verdicts signed, sealed, and carried out in daylight. The rope around their necks was not knotted by neighbors. It was tied by the state. That may be the most haunting truth of all, because it means that Salem didn't burn witches in a moment of madness. It executed them with organization, with order, with procedure. And that's what makes it so familiar. The story of Salem is not just about witches. It's about what happens when certainty replaces compassion, when institutions choose control over conscience, when fear becomes more powerful than truth. It is about what happens when good people remain silent, when the ones who know better say nothing, when those who could stop the madness look away. So, yes, Salem was a tragedy, but it wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. And if we stare into it long enough, we might not just see the faces of the dead. We might see our own. We've come to the end now. The trials are over, the gallows silent, the courts dissolved, the names mostly cleared. But what lingers is not just the horror of what was done. It's the weight of what it means. The Salem Witch Trials did not happen in the shadows. They happened in daylight, in full view, with sermons and signatures and neighbors watching. They were legal. They were religious. They were socially accepted. And they happened not in some distant, barbaric past, but in a literate, God-fearing, politically structured English colony just decades before the Enlightenment would bloom across Europe. So, what do we remember? We remember that 20 people were executed, 19 by hanging, and 1 by pressing, that at least 5 more died in prison, that dozens confessed falsely just to survive, that hundreds were accused, and that countless families were destroyed, reputations stained, lives forever altered, even for those who walked away free. We remember that the line between belief and hysteria is thinner than we'd like to admit. We remember that fear, when cloaked in virtue, can justify almost anything. We remember how easily a child's voice can become a weapon in the hands of adults who want to believe something terrible is true, how quickly suspicion becomes proof, how desperately some people will cling to order, even if that order is built on ashes. And we remember the silences. Because the truth is, most people in Salem said nothing. Not the judges, not the pastors, not the townsfolk who heard the rumors, saw the trials, watched the wagons roll past. Even those who doubted kept quiet. Because speaking up was dangerous. And dangerous things, in Salem, ended with a rope. But silence, too, is a choice. One we live with long after the shouting stops. So, we remember John Proctor, who condemned the court with his last breath. We remember Rebecca Nurse, who died whispering her innocence. We remember Giles Corey, who said more weight with his chest crushed under stone. We remember Sarah Good, who warned the judges that their blood would one day be drunk by God. We remember Ann Putnam Jr., who came forward 14 years later and admitted what she had done and asked forgiveness from a town still too ashamed to speak. And we remember the quiet ones, the ones who confessed to things they never did, the ones who died behind bars, the ones who lived but never healed. We remember them not just because of what happened to them, but because what happened to them is always possible again. Today, we may not hunt witches, but we do hunt enemies. We do divide, we do fear, and sometimes, we still believe that justice means punishment first and truth later. The machinery is different. But the pattern? That part hasn't changed as much as we like to think. So, what do we do with the story of Salem? We hold it close. We teach it, not just as history, but as warning. We speak the names of the dead. We honor the courage of those who stood firm. We recognize the silence of those who didn't, and try to do better. Because in the end, the Salem Witch Trials weren't just about witches. They were about people. People who were afraid, people who lied, people who died, and people, just like us, who were asked to choose between what was safe and what was right. Let us not forget them. And let us never, ever think it couldn't happen again.